Welcome to This Week in Correctional Institutions. This week we're going to turn our attention to prisons. Last week in our discussion on jails and detention facilities, we looked at the local landscape of our corrections system. We looked at the unique challenges of running a local correctional facility and the correction system, as well as its operations and those involved within the operation. This week, we're going to turn our attention to the prison systems at both the state and federal level. And in this week, we're going to talk about the extent to which prisons mirror our society at large and what that means. We're going to look at some of the statistical makeups of our prisons across the United States as to age, gender, and racial makeup. We're going to look at the federal jurisdictions of prisons and what that entails, and look at the state jurisdictions and see the similarities as well as differences from one state to another. We'll summarize how prisoners are housed in private facilities and discuss their effectiveness and the challenges of having private prisons within those state jurisdictions. We'll go over the different security types of correctional institutions at the state and federal level, what they look like architecturally, the basic responsibilities if you want to be a correctional administrator, and in this 21st century, what it should look like if you want to be a proactive manager in a prison system. So let's begin Chapter 6 in our correctional institutions journey on prisons. If we were to look at 21st century corrections and go back to a time when the original conception of how we could reform and rehabilitate, or at the very least, try a different approach to handle those people in our society who wronged or did wrong, committed crimes, back when our country was becoming its own autonomous nation, we would find that the objectives that were agreed upon by different reformers and different philosophers from the late 18th and early 19th century that brought us into an incarceration facility with the idea of making people repentant, with the idea of reform, really has not panned out. The idea of trying to make better the person who's coming into the facility and into the institution through whether it be religious instruction, hard work, and labor, has now turned into a philosophy of penal harm, and few offenders who come into our current correctional landscape seem to actually be any type of corrected, and many will go back into the community to reoffend and end up right back into our facilities. This is because of the decision on many parts through our current policies to have our incarceration facilities be one of no frills, where you have the purpose of corrections be to punish the offenders coming in as severely as possible, with little or no room for treatment or programs, and the idea that while you try and give them the punishment or the retribution that society is calling for, we still need to come up with a way to provide them the quality care that is required by court. And we are also trying to find some way to give them some treatment that administrators feel is necessary to actually give them some sort of goals once they get outside. So while we view 21st century prisons as sort of an ongoing conundrum, how do we punish them as society calls for, but treat them in order to give them some sort of incentive to not reoffend once they get back? We find that what we have is a prison system in our nation that is at a crossroads that we must figure out how to work with in order to bring down the prison population across the United States. One of the things that we have to consider, or must at least look at, when we're talking about comparisons of life on the inside of a prison and life within our correctional facilities, is whether life on the inside is really so much different than the life on the outside. There has been some research as to how inmates experience life on the inside over the course of the last 40 or 50 years. And while some of the most prominent research that has been done shows that there are numerous parallels between prison and the free world, what it shows is that we are a microcosm in the prison world that is a tad bit distorted. It shows that there are forces and emotions of the larger society that is magnified because it is so closed up within a small area. You see within our prisons a increase in a larger percentage of poverty, racial, gender discrimination. You will see a larger percentage of violent crime, mental illness, and more exaggerated forms within the prison culture. Other things that will be found within the prisons that are distorted because of the small confines that they find are these, what we call deprivations of confinement. The fact that it is more pronounced that they are not allowed to have contact with their family. It is more of a homogeneous same-sex environment, which keeps them from being able to have relationships that they're used to out in the society. They are kept from having employment expectations. There's racial and sexual discrimination. So all of these types of things they see at a more distorted view and more exaggerated forms. Another thing that we need to also keep in mind is if we're looking to improve our prison systems over the course of the upcoming decades, one of the things we really need to look at is how we operate our prisons. If you look at a comparison between the United States and how they utilize their prison systems and other countries across the world, you will find a stark difference depending on the area of the world that you're comparing. Now, it's true that many Western European nations follow a model similar to the United States. Countries like Great Britain and France, Germany, and Spain do follow a more punitive, retributive approach to how they run their correctional systems. But if you compare those types of retributive systems to areas such as Scandinavia, you will find that the culture and policies of things like open institutions that are prominent in places like Finland, Sweden, and Denmark have illustrated that rehabilitation and reintegration into societies can be very successful and a way to help your inmate population get back into society and reform. I encourage you to look up on YouTube, and I will also put the link on your Week 7 folder, to look up Bastøy Island on Norway. And while we look at it and we'll chuckle and kind of roll our eyes at the way that they run that island, it is a very successful prison that is run on the premise that every inmate should be treated with a modicum of respect and the assumption that they have the opportunities to either prove that they cannot be trusted or be held accountable for their actions. And basically, it's a mindset that the entire Norwegian government embraces when it comes to how they handle their correctional system. We here in the United States choose to use our prison system as a way to deal with the marginalized and disenfranchised members of our society. And then we punish them first and try and get them treatment as a result of their punishment. You will find that most Scandinavian countries do the opposite. Their policy dictates that they try and find the root cause of the issue, treat that root cause, and then punish as a result. So punishment as a policy comes as a last resort. It doesn't mean that nobody goes to prison. What it means is they will try and find why that person committed the crime, treat that cause, and then if it still requires that that person serve time, they go to prison and still maintain treatment while that person is in prison. It's a result of this that you have many open prisons, and treatment is far above punitive, isolated prisons that the United States deals with. Now, is it perfect? No. But you will find that the way that people are treated and the training of staff within these types of prisons goes far and above what we currently have, and their prison population still remains fairly low. So can prisons be improved? It depends on how policy and legislation is continued to be looked at and whether we are dedicated to any sort of serious reform on how we are going to handle the current overcrowding systems within our society. When you look at our inmate population over the last several years, we have seen a minimal decrease from its height of over 2.2 million throughout the United States in the early 2000s, mid-2000s. When we're looking at our statistics, we're going to find that as far as age is concerned, the majority of our inmate population runs between the ages of 31 to 50. we find that the next closest age population is going to be under the age of 30. Now, over half of our inmate population is going to be between the ages of 31 to 50. Over 2% is going to be 65 or older, but what you'll see within the next decade is that half of that population that we talked about, being 31 to 50, is now going to move that needle of 2% or over of the 65 and over, and that is going to become our largest age population of elderly inmates within our prison systems across the United States. So as our population of elderly start to grow, we will start to see a shift in how we have to handle a different offender population, and we'll talk about that in a later lecture on special offenders. When it comes to gender, the majority of our gender population shows, of course, that they're male. We see that the female population continues to increase depending on where your jurisdiction is. It fluctuates between 7 and 10% or so, but it's been steadily increasing since the mid-2000s. When it comes to race, you will find that the minority population is going to make up the vast majority of our population within our correctional facilities. African Americans will make up over 37%, and Hispanics will make up almost 25%, making our total minority population about 59%. Now, when you take into consideration their percentage in our society, both of those demographic groups are highly, highly overrepresented within our correctional facilities. And so that's one thing that we have to keep into consideration over the course of the rest of this semester, in that it comes back to influence a lot of what we do, not only from programming to staff to administration, to mental illness, to special offender populations. Our race and ethnicity makeup goes back to the overrepresentation of our minority inmate population and our overrepresentation of staff and administration. And so that also needs to be something that we look at and start to work with as we move forward in the 21st century. When we look at the types of offenses that most of our inmates come into our facility on, we find that the majority of state prison inmates are going to be sentenced on violent offenses. So you're looking at over 50% of our state prison inmates are going to be in on what are considered our most violent offenses. Armed robbery, murder, arson, assault, sexual assault. So that is one of those statistics that I think people need to be aware of. Drug offenses come in at about 16%, property offenses at about 19%. When you look at the breakdown between gender, violent offenses among male state prisoners are at their highest. When it comes to females, you're going to find that property offenses are the ones that females are most often put in prison for. So that's kind of a breakdown of our statistical importance when it comes to those that are in our prisons across the United States. So let's now take a look at the jurisdictional breakdown, and we're going to start with talking about our federal prison system. Up until the 1930s, anybody who was arrested on a federal offense was housed in a state prison system. The federal government had no specific institution where it could house any person who was arrested and found guilty on any of the federal crimes that they were found guilty on. It wasn't until the 1930s that the Federal Bureau of Prisons was established. It was through this that they started 11 federal prisons and put them throughout what was at that time the established United States. When we look at how much it's grown over the course of the last 89 years, what we find is that we now have 120 correctional institutions, and of those 120, they also have 13 privately operated facilities. Across the United States, they have 6 regional offices. The central location of the central office is in Washington, D.C. There's 2 staff training centers. One is in Glencoe, Georgia. And they have more than 210,000 federal offenders that are sent throughout those facilities nationwide. If they are not housed in the federal facilities, they have contracts with state and local facilities throughout the United States through contracts to hold them while their process is going on. What is dispersed through the United States with these federal facilities are several types of institutions. They have minimum, maximum, medium security, as well as a supermax. And the supermax is located in Florence, Colorado. It's called AdMax. They have detention centers, which holds people while they are waiting for their federal case to go through its proper adjudication. And they have correctional institutions, prison camps, and metropolitan correctional centers, which handles anything that is local. If you are going to be in a prison system as a federal inmate, you are going to have the opportunity to get into treatment programs, educational programs, vocational training, and they operate Unicor, which is the federal trade name for the federal prison industries that employs more than 20,000 inmates and is dedicated to making sure that any eligible inmate that can work for this institution will try and leave with some sort of vocation and will be able to go back into the workforce with some sort of trade certification. So that's kind of an overview of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. One of the things that's really hard to do is distinguish between the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the states. We're going to talk about the states in just a minute because the states each have their own Department of Corrections, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And so comparing any of the states with each other and then comparing them with the District of Columbia is going to be really hard to do. The Bureau of Prisons at the federal level operates how they think they need to, efficiently with the federal inmates that they have. And when we talk about the states in just a minute, you'll find that the states have to operate their state prison systems based on the policies and issues that come up within each individual state they have. When it comes to the state correctional prison systems, each state has its own Department of Corrections. The District of Columbia has its own Department of Corrections. And so they all have their own ideology, structure, and programming. And state departments of corrections have become concerned with improving their institutional standards. And so one of the things that they have done is try and go through an accreditation process. To go through an accreditation process, you get in touch and go through organizations that are out there that's only purpose is to work with you to set standards and modes of operation that will set policy and operational protocol to make it so that your risk management is less, so you have a higher standard of training in prison operations and correctional personnel. There's the Commission on Accreditation that's run through the American Correctional Association, which has been around since 1870 when it was known as the National Correctional Association, started by Zebulon Brockway and his group that were looking at major corrections reform back in that time period. So when they came up with ways to get state prison systems and Department of Corrections accredited, what they're looking at is how to bring up Department of Corrections in helping them develop their programming, how to bring about better work industries for their inmates, and trying to help with any architectural or construction issues that make the plant uninhabitable or unmanageable for staff and inmates. So when state correctional systems are dealing with crisis situations that bring about standards of care issues that might be brought about in a lawsuit that's looking at cruel and unusual punishment violations or 1983 claims, then what we're looking at is prison construction issues. So most of the facilities that were built in the 19th century, which were the 1800s, when most of the first prisons were built here in the United States, or the early 20th century, really are no longer in use. And if they are in use, then they've had extreme structural improvements and changes because they are not up to standards that have been established over the last century. Also, what they have to do if they're trying to bring up the standards or are trying to go through some sort of accreditation, they're going to be looking at a clarity of mission. Every established prison system or Department of Corrections should have a mission statement, what they're trying to accomplish by running their correctional system. And so what's on their plate is going to be establishing that type of clarity of mission. And that might be changing your prison model, figuring out where your resources are going to be coming from to make your correctional system safe, humane, and going above and beyond what is minimally expected of your Department of Corrections. You're also going to want to manage your corrections effectively. And how you're going to do that is try to work with greater efficiency. Make sure that you have transparency. Set out clear accountability. Make your performance standards higher than they have been, and make your programming more flexible with declaring better allocation of resources. One of the things that you can do is become a little bit more proactive with your management styles, and we're going to talk about how to be a proactive manager later on in this lecture. Another thing you can do if you're trying to improve your state services in your Department of Corrections is to integrate some of your correctional services. Now, right now, there's really only 6 states across the United States that have integrated departments, which means you're trying to blend together different areas of your correction system, which would be your adult, your juvenile corrections, your adult probation and juvenile probation, trying to blend your local jails with juvenile detention and stuff like that. If you can find a way to do some of that, you might become more efficient. You might find a way to clearly run better your correctional services. 6 states have found a way to do that. It's harder than it sounds because of some of the sizes of our Department of Corrections, but sometimes that can improve state services if you can find a way to integrate some of those departments. Training staff is always going to be one of those goals that to improve is going to make your Department of Corrections run better. It's become one of the major emphasis on corrections departments, a lot by running state correctional academies. New York and California, along with Illinois, have the most extensive training programs, both in how long they train in the academy, their state corrections officers, and how involved the staff gets. Along with that, it can't be just train them in the academy and then let it go. Once you get on the job, you have to expect what is commonly known as continuing education. In our field, we term it in-service. So in-service training, once you get into the job, you constantly are learning and relearning what you need to know to be efficient and at the best of your ability once you're on those jobs. There are plenty of training programs available in organizations across the United States, specifically at the state level for state corrections officers through the American Correctional Association, the National Institute of Corrections. At the local level, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, we have the American Jail Association. So there are organizations out there that are committed to providing education and knowledge and training to officers nationwide so that they continue to have those types of information out there. The last one is going to be upgrading standards. And that is to continue to upgrade and make not only within policy but in architectural and development of practitioners to make sure that you have everything at your fingertips and available in order to have everything that you need, both at an administration level as well as an officer level, to perform your duties on a day-to-day basis. So those are some of the ways that you can improve state services and continue on. One of the things that has entered into the correctional landscape in the last 35 years or so is the idea of the private prison. Private prison is companies that decide they are going to construct, house, and operate prisons on their own by contracting with either state, federal, or local jurisdictions to house their inmates. Private companies can also contract with government, either state, local, or federal, for prison operations, such as medical, food, manufacturing, and work, inmate labor, things like that. Now, the idea of private companies coming in and using inmate labor for manufacturing goes way back to the late 18th century and into the 19th century. And also into the 20th century, in that it wasn't uncommon for there to be a contract system where corporations would come in, companies would come in, and they would make a contract with the prison system for manufactured goods. The prison would make those goods within the prison. A lot of times the manufacturer would supply the equipment, and then they would be able to sell those manufactured goods at a lower cost because they wouldn't have the overhead of the labor force. There was also the lease system that was used in the 20th century, where companies would come and they would lease inmate labor out and also be able to purchase or make manufactured goods or get work done at a lower rate because they wouldn't have the overhead of inmate labor. Through various legislation in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, it became less and less prevalent because the workforce out in the nation took great offense at being underbid, undercut, and having their labor be dismissed by the use of inmate labor. So now we're in the 21st century, and private prisons are operated in different areas for different purposes, and there are 71 correctional institutions across 20 states that are operated by different companies. The most prevalent is Corrections Corporation of America and the GEO Group, which used to be known as Wackenhut. Corrections Corporation of America is the one that operates those 71 correctional institutions in 20 states and employs more than 13,000 individuals. The GEO Group has a few less facilities, and what we find is the jury is kind of still out on how these private prisons are run and what happens. Typically, if you are being sentenced to a private prison, you have access to certified work programs, you have medical, education, psychological services, but here's some of the things in the next slide we'll talk about that we need to take into consideration. Okay? If you are someone who wants private prisons in your jurisdiction, then you're going to say that private prisons are run more effectively because you're looking at the bottom line and you want them to run effectively because you have a profit margin that you have to be concerned with, and you have resources that you have to look at, and you have more flexibility with your management and staff recruitment because you can look at cost percentages and things like that. If you look at it from someone who doesn't want a private prison or doesn't think private prisons work, then what you're going to say is private prisons run no better, recidivism is just as bad, and that because you're running on a profit margin, construction tends to be shoddy, the programming is not as good, and that because of the profit margin that you're constantly trying to make, because you have stakeholders, you have profit sharing, you have those that have invested in the private prison and shareholders, that the bottom line is going to drive your hiring of staff, your recruitment, your training, your facilities, and therefore you're not going to hire the best people for the job. And so really the jury is still out on private facilities and whether they actually work. If you're looking at whether you want to have a private prison within your facility or within your jurisdiction, there's a lot of moral and ethical issues that still have to be resolved, because you're looking at things that are constitutionally required. And so when you're looking at what critics have to say, you're looking at things that there's higher rates of misconduct among prisoners. There is inadequate compensation to staff because they barely make more than minimum wage. If you barely make more than minimum wage as a state corrections officer, then you really are not being appreciated for the type of work that you do. A corrections officer is a law enforcement officer, whether you are working in the private sector or at a government agency. And so those are some of the things that still need to be dealt with at a private facility, and therefore we need to also look at those when dealing with the private sector and facilities. There's also legal issues that need to be dealt with. If you have private facilities that are being operated, then you are questioning just how susceptible and how accountable are the private facilities to inmate lawsuits, and how susceptible and accountable are the staff and administration when it comes to inmate rights. And we talked about inmate rights in an earlier lecture. And the Supreme Court actually got involved in that over the course of the last several years. And one of the major legal issues about whether private correctional officers have less immunity from lawsuits than state employees was decided in Richardson v. McKnight. And the Supreme Court held that correctional officers employed by a private firm are not entitled to qualified immunity. And what that means is, if you work for a private prison, you're on your own, because qualified immunity only comes into play if you are working for a governmental entity that are working within their mercurial duties for that state agency. So that means that you have no qualified immunity if you are brought up on a lawsuit by an inmate. But the Correctional Services Corporation v. Malesko defined the protections and rights of prisoners in private corporation facilities. So it said that the inmate could sue the employee of a private correctional corporation for violating their constitutional rights, but he could not sue the correctional corporation itself. So this shows that if the employees have no qualified immunity, they can be sued civilly themselves, and the private corporation cannot be sued. So it protects the facility and not the employee. Those are some huge things to take into consideration. So it shields the private prison, and the state is going to still be liable even if the private corporation is not. So here's where we've got some really distinctive legal issues that still need to be dealt with. And most recently, private prison employees cannot be sued for violating the constitutional rights of inmates, specifically those guaranteed by the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So if privately held inmates are going to sue, they have to use Section 1983. And it has to be proven that it's a tort violation, not a civil rights violation. Because being that they are in a private facility, it's a distinction that the court has been making as far as constitutional issues. So again, we're going to see these types of issues being brought up constantly as we start to deal with private facilities, making it more and more into our correctional landscape. These next couple of slides are going to be fairly easy and quick to go over, because we're going to talk about the types of security in the facilities across the United States. Now, they're basically broken down into 4 different types of security. You're either going to be in a minimum or medium security, which we'll talk about on this slide, or a maximum or supermax facility, which we'll talk about on the next slide. If you are in a minimum security prison, what we're doing is declaring that you are showing the lowest risk to the staff and other prisoners, as well as the community that this particular prison encompasses. They have more relaxed perimeter security, so typically there will not be a fence around it, or if there is, it's very minimal at best. The inmates that are going to be secured within these minimum security prisons will normally have less than a year. They have less secure type dormitory settings, and have communal showers. They get a lot more freedom, so they might have work release type settings as far as their jobs are concerned, and the policies as far as visitation are concerned are going to be a little less stringent, might even include some contact visitation and things like that. And now what we start to do is, as security increases, you're going to see the way that the architecture structure increases and how the inmates are treated is going to be more stringent. So medium security prisons are typically going to start to show signs of some sort of security on the perimeter, either with single fencing or double fencing. You might even, depending on how the prison system defines their medium security, they might have a guard tower. They might have some sort of CCTV where they're going to start monitoring from an interior point, looking out to the exterior. You might find that the cells are going to be singular or double bunked. And because of the increased security on the inside, they're no longer going to have or allow inmates to have freedom of movement, and they're going to have to store their things in locked storage containers. The inmates will have access to treatment programs, still have some freedom of movement, but the idea is that they will be secured inside a perimeter fencing. So we start with the lowest security, where they have a lot of freedom of movement, typically no perimeter, and we start to move up a little bit more from there with medium security. With maximum security, you're talking about a physical plant that has, at the very least, double fencing with razor wire. If you have the type of construction or an older prison, you might see stone walls with guard towers that could be as high as 2 feet or more. 25 feet or more. Sorry, 25 feet or more. You're going to see close security where inmates are going to be in single or maybe 2-person cells, and you're going to have no communal areas whatsoever. And maximum security will have either segregation or administrative segregation. The idea behind this is isolation, and it starts with a period of time where the person is going to be given isolation not only on a regular basis but also as punishment. Freedom of movement is minimal, and treatment for programming is at a selection process where it is up to the behavior of the inmates whether they will be allowed to participate in any sort of treatment programs. Supermax is something that has only been in the correctional landscape existence for about 20 years. It started with the Tams Correctional Facility and moved its way to California with the Corcoran and Pelican Bay facilities in that area. It's based solely upon the isolation of prisoners, where they are in their cells away from any other inmates or staff for long periods of time. And the Supermax model is typically based on the old Pennsylvania style, where it's one inmate to one cell, where they have no contact with anybody during their entire stay. Right now, we have 57 Supermax facilities across the United States, and some of our best and most notorious criminals stay in these facilities and rely on the current technology and hard construction to utilize the philosophy behind our Supermax. The best known today Supermax facility is the federal Supermax facility located in AdMax, Florence, Colorado. Now, some of the pros and cons behind having a Supermax facility. The pros are that you need them to control inmates whose behavior is so disruptive that you can't manage them. And that those that are simply too dangerous. If you're looking at people like Dzhokhar Tsarnaev or Terry Nichols, who was part of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1993, some of the gangs that you have in the California facilities and the leaders that you have, those are inmates who are considered to be so disruptive that you can't have them in any sort of general population, even in a max facility. Some of the cons is that you keep people in isolation for an extended period of time, they will begin to exhibit signs of sensory deprivation. And therefore, any chance of leading any sort of life outside of Supermax, if they have any sort of release date, might tend to be impossible. And therefore, by assigning somebody to Supermax for extended periods of time, you are basically saying we give up on this inmate and we are not even looking at possibly rehabilitating them. So we have to look at the pros and cons and looking at whether we are using Supermax prisons in the right context. So those are the 4 types of security facilities. Let's continue on with this discussion. One of the reasons that this was adopted as a possible way to handle some of the most dangerous criminals was some of the violence that we saw in the facilities over the years. And we found that even though we had this violence in our Supermax facilities, they increased the segregation in these Supermax facilities. So you have a Supermax facility that is already supposed to be the highest security level that you can get. And yet, because we still had violence at the height of the gang participation in our facilities, what we get is the use of special security housing units, or SHUs. And these are extreme isolation units where you have no chance of having any sort of contact with any other inmate and very little with anybody else. You get fed in your cells, you stay in your cells 24 hours a day. The only time you are let out is to clean your room and shower. So maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And then you are not let out when any other inmate is around. So the SHUs have become predominantly used within supermax facilities to make them even more isolated than the original maximum supermax facilities. When you're looking at constructing an early prison, there were going to be 4 specific types: the radial, telephone, courtyard, and campus. They were specific for reasons, and we'll look at each individual style of prison design over the next several slides. The structural design of early prisons were created to produce specific outcomes, and that was moral reformation, as we talked about in Chapter 1. The cells being isolated were intended to make sure that the inmates coming in were allowed to contemplate, work, and serve their penitence. And so what we have are these 4 styles that we will reduce down into why they were chosen, what they accomplished, and why they are not used much anymore. The radial style design had corridors that extended out like spokes from a control center hub. As you saw in Chapter 1, this is what Eastern State Penitentiary looked like, and it was the first prison that utilized this radial design. We also have a couple of other prisons that utilized this radial design. The Federal Penitentiary in Leavenworth, as well as state penitentiaries at Rahway and Trenton in New Jersey, were utilized the radial design, which has these, which looks like a spokes on a wheel. If you were to look at what wheels look like, the central hub, and then the out spokes, which is where the cells would be located. The telephone pole design became much more prevalent in the 20th century. Mostly used for maximum security prisons, this was used when Marion, Illinois was built in for federal penitentiary use, as well as Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Georgia. It makes it possible to house prisoners according to classification, which became a lot more prevalent in the 20th century. The one big disadvantage to the telephone pole is that if you have militant convicts, those that take control, they can barricade a corridor. So if you have hostage-taking situations or an inmate disturbance on a large scale, they can take control of a cell house, and it makes it very hard for the officer corps to take back control. When looking at the courtyard design, we find that newer prisons really use this courtyard design because of the housing unit architecture. When we look at the Washington Corrections Center for Women in Gig Harbor, this is where women's prisons typically get their architectural style, and is built around the fact that it's multi-level and has landscaped courtyards. It has security without fences, which provided an avenue for escape in the early 70s, and this resulted in the use of fencing. You have small housing units that has the idea of day rooms, and with the idea behind the Washington Corrections Center for Women, the expectation was that the women would be treated as such as long as they acted as such. You had programming that worked around education, recreation, and training, and if you were allowed into the courtyard or away from the courtyard, you had these attractive apartments. The idea was that there was a distinctive difference between how women's prisons were going to be designed and men's prisons were going to be designed. And that was done with intent once it was decided that women were going to be held away from men, which we'll talk about in a later lecture when we talk about women inmates and the population that they encompass. The campus design is used specifically for minimum security, maybe medium security, but typically for minimum security, where it has this open design that we talked about when we were talking about what prisons are made up of, the security of them, and it allows for a lot of freedom of movement. What you have is, it looks like a college campus. You have housing units that are scattered among the units that are designated for educational use, vocational use, working use, and that style of thing. They usually are surrounded by a fence unless they are designated minimum security, and then they will typically not have a fence. Women's prisons also will typically use a campus style if they don't use a courtyard style, and therefore you will find that the federal prison camp at Alderson, which is a federal women's prison, also will use this type of campus style. And so those are the type of styles that typically were used back in the early 20th century and in the 19th century as we were building our prisons. So now let's take a look at exactly what the administration does within our facilities. At the top we have the warden or superintendent, the person who is ultimately responsible to run the facilities that they are put in charge of, and sets about who is the one who is going to be ultimately responsible for everything that the prison is going to be doing outside. For the custodial services, which means who takes care of the inmates and other things like that, he puts a deputy or an associate warden in charge. And so what happens is, if you are going to be the warden of a facility, you are the administrator. You are the one who decides what's going to take place. You establish policy. You make sure that any of the goals, any of the methods, the mission of the institution is carried out. What happens as far as the instilling of the policies, the carrying out of the goals, things like that, the happenings that goes on with the staff, anything to do with custody, you delegate to your assistant warden. And so the way that I try and explain it, if I may, is the warden handles everything that might look to the outside, how things look to the society at large. He answers to the executive director of the Department of Corrections. He's going to set the policy of how the prison is going to run, and then he gives it to his assistant warden, and the assistant warden has to implement it and tell his custodial staff and his custodial services, this is how we're going to do it within the scope of the policies, goals, and missions. It's also the responsibility of the warden to manage any lawsuits and to resolve any grievances if it gets up to him. So the warden is the person who is in charge to make sure that what he puts in place is going to work, and then he sets about delegating to those people who are going to put it in motion. It is also up to the warden and administrators to keep up on what's going on within the facility and to provide for any inmates that come into the facility that might need some special inmate care. The warden must find ways to maintain this communication between the inmates as well as staff. If the inmates have special needs, such as mental illness or emotional issues, anybody like communicable diseases, they need to figure out the best way to handle those. Now, what he needs to do is communicate through the different people within his administration. That's going to be assistant wardens, through either his operations or through his programming. That's finding things through his command staff and how that works down. So communication is going to be vitally important from the warden on down his chain of command to find out the best way to do this. He's also responsible for staff development. That's going to be coming up with training programs, not only for the new staff that comes on board, but also in-service training for existing staff throughout their career. And so it's also a responsibility to keep staff morale up and keep their job involvement so that they can find things within their career to keep them participating in their job as well as decision making, and make sure that they feel they are involved enough to keep the operation of the facility going. The warden also has to be good at fiscal management. You always have to be able to keep your institutional budget functional so that you can work within the confines of the resources that you have and keep abreast of developments within the status of your budget so that you know whether you're going to have any sort of shortfalls or excesses that you will be able to take advantage of or need to decrease your resource or reallocate resources that you have. So these are the things that having a good correctional manager needs to be aware of, and something that correctional administrators need to strive for. One of the things that correctional managers should strive for is to be proactive. To be proactive, you need to take an approach that is focused on anticipating problems rather than being reactive to them. So you want to anticipate to prevent and be able to maintain institutional control. To do this, you come into your job as a warden believing that you can make a difference. You believe that you can run your institution in a way that inmates and staff believe that there is hope, respect, and confidence for one another. Proactive wardens are going to believe in treating inmates with dignity and respect and have a more hands-on approach. You don't sit at your desk and make policies that way without having some sort of interactive approach with staff as well as inmates. You're going to, as a proactive warden, make sure that the prison is safe for both inmates and staff, and emphasize that through cleanliness and orderliness. You make sure that you stay receptive to technological innovations and use those advantages as soon as they can become available to corrections. So the idea is to make sure that you are looking for ways to always get better and make your facility yours through a wide variety of ways that make it so that you are looking toward the future, you're anticipating issues, and being ahead of the game. And so becoming a proactive warden is a way to be that forward-thinking administrator that's going to make sure that not only your staff wants to be there and help you with this, but your inmates feel that they can better themselves and be part of a truly revolutionary institution that is there to give them resources and programming to make them better. In this lecture, we talked about prisons in the scope of where they were to where we are and in the future. We identified the extent to which prisons mirror the larger society by talking about the fact that they mirror it, but in a more distorted view. We looked at the demographics of our prison system by looking at age, gender, and racial makeup. We looked at both the federal jurisdiction as well as state jurisdictions and what sets them apart from each other, and looked at how many prisoners are housed within our private facilities and why this continues to be an issue. We looked at the security types of correctional institutions and the architectural types by describing what they looked like. We talked about correctional responsibilities of the administrator and looked at our proactive style of what a new 21st century administrator should look like. Your discussion question for this week is going to take you to page 176, 177 in your book. It's the blue-gray area called Techno-Corrections. Make sure you read this section and answer the question in a 350-word post. When you're done, dialogue with classmates about what they think about this section, and make sure you use concepts from the chapter to assist you with your answer. Thank you for your attention. Join me next week when we go into Chapter 7 on the prison experience when we talk about males and female inmates. Until then, have a good week, and I'll talk to you next time.